I would try to impart resilience to students. My reasoning was that, society, when they get out into the real world, they're not going to be protected. So even though they're young, you do want to, you can't be too harsh, right? But you do need to get them a little bit along the path to develop a thicker skin on some situations where they can function. That was always met with, well, we're trying to change society. If your goal is to change society rather than to raise a functional child, well, then that dysfunction is actually a good thing, because they're not going to be content with society as it is. And that's what I think we're kind of seeing is this rise in anxiety, this rise in mental illness in children going out into the real world and demanding that the world conform.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Ricky Allpike, and joining me once again is Jonathan Astro. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, Ricky. I'm very excited to chat to Paul Rossi, who was unfairly cancelled years ago. Like you will be cancelled one day, Ricky. So
I can only hope.
Note. Yeah, you're doing a good job on the other podcast.
Yes, I know. Before we throw it to the interview, it's probably a good idea we mention the fact that Paul changed microphones sort of after about 10 minutes or so. So you'll kind of hear a difference in his voice. It becomes much richer and fuller after that 10 minutes. So
I have nothing to add. Yes, that happened.
Paul Rossi is a former high school maths teacher whose outspoken views on the anti-racism training being taught in his high school got him cancelled. Paul has subsequently written many articles exposing the woke indoctrination sweeping through the schools in the US, and also runs Chalkboard Heresy with Frank McCormick. Chalkboard Heresy is a website and media programming brand that produces content relevant to public school teachers, parents, and students who are concerned about woke indoctrination in kindergarten through to year 12. Paul, welcome to the New Flesh.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So before we delve into your personal story and other things, I think it might be helpful for our audience if we spend a little time on critical race theory. For quite a while now, we've heard that CRT is an esoteric subject taught in some Ivy League law schools only, and that what is being taught in schools is probably history or just how it is or something like that. What's your current perspective on critical race theory?
Well, they're not wrong. They're not entirely wrong about that. I mean, it did germinate in its current form, that the phrase critical race theory, from an academic investigation, critical legal studies in law schools in the 70s. But effectively, what it means today for teachers and students in our education system is a form of praxis whereby these ideas about the nature of America, the United States, and British-speaking European colonial powers generally, are that society has been organized to privilege one racial group over others, and that sort of original sin permeates to this day, and it has tremendous explanatory power for why disparities persist, even when progress has been made legally to extend the rights to all citizens. So there's a constant awareness and sort of a permeating narrative, which is pushed out to all students, all teachers, all administrators, all faculty, all staff, everyone involved in the project of education, that the legacy of slavery is the dominant force in our lives, in the lives of minorities and white people, and that gives privilege to white people and continues to oppress marginalized groups such as American blacks and Asians and so on.
So what does it mean? What do we mean when people say, is it being taught in schools? You know what I mean? So how do we link all of that theory with how it's actually being delivered in real terms?
Right. So if you think of it like a kind of a distillation process from the academic papers in the 70s, going to the subsequent scholarship in the 80s and 90s, and then getting into education, schools, and promoters of these theories as they move into institutions like the educational system. And so it is a form of activism at that point. It sort of hops over or kind of migrates from mere scholarship into activism. And so the teachers that are coming out of ed schools, my colleagues, both in public and private schools, are see themselves as activists and see their job as to rectify the disparities in society. And so part of that is raising children, teaching them to themselves become activists and pursue the path of equity sort of being the reallocation of shares in society, which is basically a socialist project, Marxist project.
Well, do proponents of CRT, do they call it critical race theory, or do they prefer terms like anti-racist training or inclusion training?
Yeah, I mean, some of them really do. And Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the the creators of critical race theory, or one of its offshoots, intersectionality, they do embrace the term, and they talk about it being an academic discipline that they don't do in schools. They're correct in that they don't teach it as an academic discipline in schools. They practice it. I think that's really the distinction that's being effaced there. But yes, they do. I mean, it's their term. It finds its expression in anti-racism, anti-racist policies, DEI, all of these various forms of interventions. But it is, and then there's of course offshoots of it from that tree. So whiteness studies is one example. There's an entire branch devoted to whiteness and what whiteness is as property and so on. And that's very dominant in these schools as well. They really want racial consciousness among the students, so that they can be self-consciously aware of how to be an ally in certain situations and how to see their peers in terms of group dynamics and so on.
But I just thought, one of your answers there, you mentioned that some of your colleagues see themselves as activists. I see this as such a fascinating thing because I can imagine a thought experiment where if you take one of your colleagues and they've got a child and then they were in my class and then I'm teaching them about the god of Jupiter or something, or teaching them about, could be anything that I'm passionate about, that is not to do with teaching maths or English. How do they square? It's just so presumptuous to me to think that you should be meddling with people's values in that way. Don't you think?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I feel like I can take their perspective because it was my perspective for a long time. I would have aligned with this, a decade ago. I would never have seen myself in this position. But it really is a form of, it does have that religious cast to it, but you're really on the side of the angels. You are implementing justice in society. That's social justice. So as a social justice, you might not want to call yourself a social justice warrior. Some of them fully embrace that term, unironically.
Wow.
But you really are. You're pursuing this new God, which is derived from the God of history, the God of essentially dialectical Marxism, which is just in a different form. And you're here to transform society on Earth, and that is essentially your mission. And many of my colleagues have told me that to my face when I pushed them on it. So when you have that kind of moral imperative driving your pursuit, I think there is a real connection broadly between education and morality, right? So the idea that these moral knights are coming into this profession with the passion and the commitment to change society it doesn't surprise me. It's not unusual in that regard. I think in the past it might have been a religious mission, say, but it is a mission. The interesting thing is that it's being what we see as a secular society or a secular domain now, where religion has sort of left the culture. It's been replaced, I think, by this wokeism, which is essentially a set of moral intuitions, which are sort of substituting for the richer tradition, which has been left behind or dismantled.
Well, we're not just seeing this in public schools. A lot of high-end private schools are pushing diversity and equity training and critical race theory, but not only on their students, but on the parents as well. So prospective parents at the Brearley School, an all-girls school on the Upper East Side, are informed on their application that parents are expected to attend 2 diversity, equity, inclusion and anti-racism workshops per school year and write a 500-word essay demonstrating their fealty to those values. There are a number of other schools that do a similar thing, and your former high school, Grace Church High School, required children in 2020 to sign a pledge promising that they would fight against racial propaganda and interrupt biases. How widespread is the requirement that parents get this CRT and diversity training?
Well, partly because of what I did and what my friend Andrew Gutman did at Brearley, is they're being much more careful about getting the parents on board. And so not only in the examples you mentioned, but also the enrollment contracts that parents sign. They may not explicitly say that they have to align with the ideology, but they make it clear that if they dissent with any aspect of the curriculum, their child can be immediately taken out of the school. So with private schools in particular, which is my background and what the school I was teaching at, they are being much more aggressive in filtering out any dissent. And a lot of these places have become self-selecting because they're not most of them at the elite level are not hurting for applicants. So they can afford to be very selective. And then the fact that when the community becomes more aligned with this mission, you kind of have this purity spiral where more and more of the parents who are aligned with it are bringing their kids in. And so I don't see it, unfortunately, getting any better at these schools. I think what we really need are viable alternatives for parents that are just done with this and fed up with this, what they're doing to their kids. And so starting a school in New York City is extremely expensive, but I hope that somebody can make that happen because we really need some alternatives.
The question I have about that, Paul, is aren't these schools? Why is the answer that it's hard to not be conspiratorial about this, because that they get together and they go, oh, well, there's pushback and these parents are getting involved. That's terrible. That's terrible. And I love that the answer in the meeting is, well, we need to come up with a more robust contract. Clearly, like it's not like it's so. Isn't it exhausting to go down that route? Why I know that you were in this situation, and there's probably maybe another person like you in the room quietly sitting, staring at the floor, who wants to say, I got an idea. How about we just have a bit of chill and, why have we got to go on about race all the time? And
that would be very problematic. because that person would immediately out themselves as being regressive or whatever. And it's a great question, because it seems so incongruous and ironic, right? These are the schools where the elites of the elite, the Brahmins of the Brahmins, are sending their kids. The money is not made through socialism. Let's be frank, okay? This is money made on Wall Street. This is money made in the world of high finance, and so. How can it be that these schools, are pushing these what other people have called them luxury beliefs, essentially like a kind of a Potemkin belief system, so aggressively, and a lot of it has to do with these schools have a real image problem and a real sense of the loss of their own moral authority around their own elitism. So. Particularly demographically. Okay, so many of these schools only recently, admitted girls or Jews or, let's be honest, black kids. So they need to compensate and make up for this image. So they're going so hard, particularly as they bring in, they bring opportunities to a demographic that could really use it, right? The social capital that these schools offer is tremendous, and so they need some way to sort of dampen the potential for any cultural conflict, okay? Because you do have very, very different kids from very, very different backgrounds in the same ecosystem, okay? This is supposed to be a community, but when one of the kids is, going on Christmas break to the to the Hamptons or to Bermuda, and the other one is going to go take care of their cousin in their 2-room apartment in Harlem. Okay, there's a lot of potential for, and the parents of those students are in contact, and the mere perception that some wealthy parent is going to look down their nose at my child, that is sort of a PR disaster. So the schools are on a kind of a hyper alert to this kind of thing. To the point where if 2 girls on a field trip who are rooming with another group of students, and they all start singing a Drake song and they sing the N-word, this is a bombshell, right? Because some of the parents see this on Snapchat, and then suddenly, we have to have 3 days of intensive bias training and anti-racist training to address this disaster. We all have to, beat our breasts and claim that the school is a racist institution because girls are simply just having fun singing to a song. This is the kind of hysteria that creates a kind of a crucible environment where, the greatest evil that's possible is that someone could feel slighted racially. Now, you also have the added structural situation where you have a group, a kind of professional association of these schools, to which all of the schools belong now. It's called the National Association of Independent Schools, and there are 1,800 schools nationwide, and there's maybe 2,200 nationally. And this organization really sets the tone around equity, inclusion, belonging, diversity. They have a thing called the Principles of Good Practice for diversity, for equity and inclusion. And so this organization is tremendous cover, right? Because every school can say, we align with the Principles of Good Practice from the National Association of Independent Schools. Now, the National Association of Independent Schools on their part runs a hiring network. So they have a whole ecosystem around who gets hired as heads of school, as administrators. And they have a flagship conference called the People of Color Conference, which I watched, it was online last year, and I watched all 100 hours of it. It was fascinating. And it's deeply, deeply infused with, transformative ideologies, whether that's gender theory, critical race theory. I will say again, a lot of this stuff is really cultural. It's broad based, and it's coming out of sort of the children of the revolution that were taught by academics in American universities. So there are several currents that are all flowing together to create this sort of massive movement in not just education but corporate America, and it's a global thing too. So you see it with things like SEL and ESG and CRE, culturally relevant education. You see it with comprehensive sex education. There's just a host of these sort of 3-letter acronyms that are pushed by massive foundations like the Gates Foundation, Chan Zuckerberg, through UNESCO, and I mean, it's a broad-based thing, and it's global, as I'm sure you can attest. So there's a lot going on.
Well, just while we're in this sort of neighborhood, I got a question before we get onto your school. Can we just talk broadly about New York? Because we talked to quite a few people from New York for obvious reasons. It's a cultural epicenter of the world, arguably. And I always ask this: in a state that is a democratic stronghold, particularly in education, where the unions are unquestioningly all left-leaning, and you mentioned some other organisations that I'm sure are all involved. When problems or issues arise, if there's no conservative in the room, or no centre-right or centrist moderate or whatever, aren't you always beholden to the most extreme left members? Like that, because if it's left on left all the time, and we get this in the arts scene as well. So if you've got a room of people. Everyone in the room's on the left. So what happens is the most emotive arguments, the most grueling purity tests will always win, and that's always coming from the extreme left. So if there's no one to the moderate or to the right, it seems we have to cede always to those extreme lefts. So in New York particularly, do you find that this is the situation?
Yeah, I mean, and some of it has to do with sort of the mode of argument on the left, which tends to be more pathos-driven than logos-driven. So if somebody feels slighted, if somebody feels if their feelings have been damaged, or they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel like they belong, this is considered an argument, right? So if somebody has a particular affect around how they feel like they're being perceived, this needs to be discussed. There needs to be a quote brave conversation about it, and that person's experience is legitimate, right? The worst thing you can do to someone is to quote unquote gaslight them on their feelings. What that is, I think, driving a lot of this is the more sensitive a person is, and sensitivity is not a bad thing, but it's become a massive dragon which has just escaped the cage, and now there's no limit to how sensitive someone can be, right? And that to talk about that in school, I would try to impart resilience to students. I would say, well, my reasoning was that society, when they get out into the real world, they're not going to be protected. So even though they're young, and you do want to, you can't be too harsh, right? But you do need to get them a little bit along the path to develop a thicker skin on some situations where they can function. That was always met with, well, we're trying to change society, right? So if your goal is to change society rather than to raise a functional child, well, then that dysfunction is actually a good thing, because they're not going to be content with society as it is. And that's what I think we're kind of seeing is this rise in anxiety, this rise in mental illness in children going out into the real world and demanding that the world conform, even as young adults or 20-somethings or 30-somethings.
They're all the people getting fired from Twitter right now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And posting pictures of their laptops with stickers all over them saying, "It's my last day."
That's right. That's right. Well, then I think of the video there was an internal video I remember seeing where someone described their experience at the Twitter headquarters, and it was mostly meditation and going to the coffee machine and all these things that eventually that can't really be sustained. So if it wasn't Elon Musk that was going to come in and do it, somebody else would have done it.
Well, this idea of resilience, it's not a new thing. Like, the Eastern philosophers would talk about, putting leather on the soles of your feet rather than trying to put leather, over the entire world, so that you can be protected against some of the feelings that you might encounter out in the real world when you do have to try and get along with a colleague that you don't like, or any number of situations that can make you feel a certain way. Like, is there much resilience practice or education going on in schools in the US?
It's funny because two things. One, I was able to convince the administration to let me teach a course on Stoic philosophy, which I think has a lot in common with what you're talking about. It's sort of the Western tradition of that. And the students really, I think, enjoyed it. We read some of the great thinkers, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and we talked about how to do things in daily life where we could encounter the slings and arrows of different opinions without allowing our embodied reactions, because right, we do have feelings about it, right, but not let those feelings dictate our actions. So we're not acting out of our feelings, and it does align with a lot of meditative practices. But when I hear the term resilience, when I started to hear it in 2020. Post George Floyd, it was really about white resilience, in the context of you can't shirk your goals as being anti-racist, and if your efforts in that area flag, well, then you're not showing the appropriate resilience. You're showing fragility. So they've taken that word as well.
Perhaps at this stage of the interview, we should talk about your experience at Grace Church High School. Can you tell us a little bit about your former school and your role there?
Well, I really liked the school. I mean, I had taught there since 2012 when the high school opened. I was a founding member of the high school, which is 14 to 18 year old students. And the course that I taught was math. I've always loved math since I studied it in high school, and this was a second or third career for me. I started teaching in my 40s, and I just love to express the beauty of math and show that to the students and to get them engaged. And I did have to attend a training because the school always fancied itself as progressive from its inception, and that was in many ways its sort of marketing proposition, was that the colleges and universities wanted progressive kids. So if they made a high school as a kind of incubator, then they would be able to, that they would have an advantage over other schools in the selection of these students. So I attended a 2-day training session called Undoing Racism, which was an all-day training run by a group called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which was a very, very radical group, which the school contracted with. And you can look up their website. They're called pisab.org. And it was a fascinating experience. And I remember coming out of that kind of converted, kind of in a culty way, kind of, the lights came on, and I realized my privilege, and I felt like I needed to go out into the world and transform society myself.
It's like Landmark Forum.
Yeah, it's funny. It was a weekend, and that's very much how it works. They break you down. They ask you questions.
Don't go to the bathroom too much. Like, stay in your seat. Stay hungry.
Right. Show that resilience. Yeah. But most of the time I was kind of left to my own devices, and there's tremendous independence in a school, particularly a new school, on how you could construct the curriculum. There was just myself and another teacher. She was very much a mentor to me because I was a new teacher. And I just loved being around the kids and the energy and the fun and learning and all the good things. Gradually there was this, they started to hire more full-time diversity positions. They had an Office of Community Engagement, which I thought was supposed to be about how the school would engage with the community, but it was really about how the community would engage with society. So, these word games are really fascinating. And they became more aggressive in 2017 around explicitly becoming a, quote, anti-racist school. And I remember being asked to teach a, quote, pyramid of racism to 9th graders. I had a special group of advisees. And this pyramid essentially said that at the top it had genocide. And further down in the pyramid, there were things like, 2 sides to every story. Or, my black friend says X, which were supposed to be unacceptable objections to any anti-racist theory if you have a black friend who says the opposite of that. But then, of course, next to that was also something called not believing people of color. So you seem like a double bind. Do I believe the person of color, or I can't use that as evidence? So you're basically in a situation where you're constrained to agree with this material psychologically, and I said I wouldn't teach it. And they kind of patted me on the head and said, it's okay. You don't have to teach this. We're going to we'll give you the training that you need. And so the idea that you could have the training and object to it simply meant that you needed more training. So this is cult logic, right? So if either you progress according to the steps that we have laid out for you, and they actually had, 8 steps of progression in anti-racism, and it's okay if you're at the lower steps because we're all learning, right? We're all in it's okay to be over here. We just want to get you from here, further along so that you don't cause harm to the students, right? Harm is the constant rationale that if you don't evolve in your anti-racist journey, then you're going to cause racial trauma to the students, particularly the students of color. And so the logic is always self-justifying. And the idea that you could step outside of it or ask a difficult question which might lead people to different conclusions means that you're not in step with the anti-racist mission. Now, I happen to think that what they call the anti-racist mission or goals are simply premises, and they've put the cart before the horse. They've actually confused the premises with the goals. Their premise is CRT, essentially, that society is organized to protect the privilege of white people and to to oppress people of color. If that is your a priori position, well, then that is an anti-racist premise that you're making about the need for anti-racism according to a particular prescription, which has to be extremely radical and require people to look and think of themselves as racialized beings. And in 2021 February, that was when I kind of had my breaking point, which led to me leaving the school, which was I was put in a segregated meeting with only white faculty and staff and children. So white identified students were in this meeting, only white identified students. And this was supposed to be a meeting about how to take care of yourself during the pandemic, and it turned into a struggle session about white identity and white culture, and why white culture, in particular, things like objectivity, things like showing, perfectionism or worship of the written word, or timeliness, things like that were actually white supremacy. And now the person running this session was very nice. She was a 20-something young woman. And we actually had a very productive discussion during the meeting, and a lot of people thought it was great, but I had to say something, right? Because as a math teacher, if you come after objectivity, you better come hard, because I am not going to let you racialize objectivity, okay? Objectivity, mathematics is we can communicate with alien life forms with the language of mathematics once we sorted out the language details, right? Because it's simply truth.
Only white aliens.
Right, exactly. And of course, since, how debilitating is this message that mathematics is objective, but objectivity is white, as if to say China or India or Africa or all these other places, the Arab world, didn't make tremendous contributions to mathematics, where, mathematics is a global birthright for every culture, has contributed to it. And you're going to say now to me that, if I talk about objective truth, that's a white thing? I'm sorry, at that point, you're a white supremacist.
Just on that, are we implanting a cognitive dissonance in kids' minds by teaching them that science and maths on the one hand, which are reason and logic-based pursuits, but on the other hand, forcing social justice views on them, which increasingly see logic, reason, and objectivity as unimportant at best and tools of white supremacy at worst? Like, what are these opposing ideas going to do to younger generations?
Oh, well, you're right. And that's what SEL is for. Social emotional learning is to reconcile the cognitive dissonance that they have between, trust the science and, your feelings are the most important thing. So if you see knowledge as being instrumental in social change, instead of truth, you are going to have massive contradictions, okay? And, having students reflect their own mental states and physical states of confusion back to themselves with questionnaires and kind of staying in touch with their feelings is going to keep them in a passive, receptive state where they are simply thinking about, their own well-being and health, and they're not actually, that to me is the ultimate gaslighting, right? They're not actually going to raise uncomfortable questions about these contradictions. They're going to personalize them and try to, think of, well, how can I cope with this? It really is quite sinister in my view. And, it's something that I haven't looked into completely, but I think that there's a lot of really dangerous stuff there.
So back to our training session, you voice your dissent. How did that go?
Well, I was the facilitator put up the slide that said all of these various characteristics of white supremacy. I later found out that this instrument, this PowerPoint, is basically copy-pasted from something from 2001, written by a woman like in a day who had a bad day. And so there's absolutely there's no empirical basis for this whatsoever. It really is just something that was just copied from place to place and seemed to fit the narrative, and everyone, and you'll see it everywhere. I mean, it's in corporate trainings, it's in education, it's everywhere. And then, she said something to the students, and I can see in the Zoom meeting that all of the students, they have bowed heads. Their posture is supplicatory. They look, that they're scared to and I know not all of them agree with it. And she says to the group, well, as you look at this list of characteristics of white supremacy culture, you may start to have white feelings.
I hate those.
And I had to punch the unmute, and I said, what is a white feeling? And I betrayed some annoyance, I'm not going to lie, but I tried to, ask it in a constructive way, because I knew that, whiteness has become this kind of catch-all taboo, right? You can just throw anything into it, right? Think of any object and make it white, and then suddenly it's this carrier of some primordial historical evil. So, she said, well, that started a debate, right? So that, some people in the chat was going, and some students started chiming in, and even some of my colleagues started chiming in, and that sort of started an authentic discussion broke out. I was very pleased because I was irritated, and I had sort of had it with the fact that these students in every one of these meetings I had seen, none of these students had ever seen a teacher publicly object in any substantive way to what was being presented to them as knowledge, when it is actually belief. It's just a set of beliefs, okay, like a religion, like you were saying, and they're being presented to them as knowledge, and it is just deeply wrong. And so I wanted to question it, and my hope was, that I knew I would get blowback and pushback, and that was great. Like, people were saying, Mr. Rossi, you don't understand because you have privilege, and you're white and you don't get it, and and I was like, okay. But other kids were saying, look, I don't think I'm ignorant just because I'm white. I think it's more complex than this. Some of the teachers came out, and one woman started crying that she's from Europe, and how she struggles with her white identity, but she thinks that these things go too far. And it was sort of like a mental prison break going on. And I was pleased, and I was encouraged to actually sort of question the nature of racial identity in the first place, right? Racial identity, if it is, and I think it is, a social construct that was created, it covers a lot of bases, but it's actually in itself, it doesn't mean anything, right? Culture, ethnicity, and ancestry, these are real things. Race is a proxy for that is a sort of convenient fiction, and now we're going to re-racialize the kids with this thing, which is a fiction, to sort of internalize it. How do you get from, point A to B to C, where from internalizing it, you're actually going to transcend it? That's not how things work, right? What you see in the world is what you are, what you become, and you just embody it harder and harder. So I said, I didn't say I didn't think I was white, but I did say, to what extent must I identify with a category of identity simply because other people see me that way, which is the basis for their logic, is that if you pass as white, or if you're seen as black, then it's as if you are. So you're treated with a social opprobrium or privilege based on that. And my statement was, well, if everybody jumped off, if everyone told you that you should jump off a bridge, should you jump off the bridge? Should you adopt a falsehood simply because everyone else believes it's true? And since their belief is so deeply social constructionist, they would say, well, you actually can't not believe it. You're not allowed to not believe it because you have no independent understanding of truth outside of your social context. And I don't think that's true. I think we have all kinds of ways of understanding truth, no matter what the social context, if we're presented with contradictions. And isn't it irresponsible for the people whose job it is, who see deeply through the fiction of race, to perpetuate it on these kids? So I questioned the nature, the reality of race, essentially. But I didn't question its reality so much as I questioned its truth, right? Things can be false and real at the same time. And I really wanted to explore that distinction. But I wasn't allowed to proceed with the argument or the investigation, because I subsequently had my classes taken away, and I had to attend several multi-hour meetings with the administration where they would try to get me to recant or admit to the harm that I caused and so on. And I didn't do that. And when I didn't do that, they became more and more aggressive, accused me of harassment, accused me of, causing trauma to the students with my questions. Even though the result 2 days later, the facilitator came back to the school and said, I thought it was a great discussion. I understand that people were a little bit upset. And we have to be careful about that. But Mr. Rossi's comments were not, meant in bad faith. I mean, and so I think.
But was that facilitator sort of disappeared in the Chinese Communist Party sense, like after that?
I don't know. I know that
she hasn't come up in any of the follow-ups that we've read about online.
No. She'd been asked for comment multiple times, but
she's
she
out there
silent.
sitting there reading Common Sense, reading all the stuff, and just going, "Ooh, hope my phone doesn't ring."
Yeah, it's a tough position, and I think. I almost don't blame her because
it's weird though. If I worked at the New York Times, I read your story in the New York Times. If I worked in the New York Times, I might be giving her a call.
They did, right.
And
they just declined to comment. As far as I know,
yes.
I mean, I was told I was asked if I could help. I was asked if I could help get them in touch with her, and I said I don't think she would talk to me. But
I love it. I love it when they go, "Oh, okay, we'll leave it then." Like, and they don't always do that though. They don't always go, "Oh,
that's
okay,
a difficult.
We'll leave it then."
That's a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
They seem to they claim to like difficult conversations.
Well, how did you go from that meeting to then writing a piece for Barry Weiss's Substack?
Yeah, so I didn't have my classes reassigned, immediately. I continued to teach. We taught hybrid, so we had some days in school and some days virtual. But when in cases when we were in school, I had to teach both virtually and in the classroom. So there were live kids and kids on Zoom, and it's very technically demanding. A lot of us struggled with that, but we did the best we could. Many of the teachers, many of my colleagues were using me as an object lesson in their classes with the students. I can think of at least two who did this because I heard from other people that I was sort of a case study or poster boy in white fragility. Right, Mr. Rossi is an example of what of how white people can react when confronted with with a mirror is held up to their own privilege and white supremacy. And then they read a statement to the entire school at the exact same moment in time. I think I discussed this in the article where they talked about a certain individual. Everyone knew who it was. It was me, who questioned the reality of racism. I didn't question the reality. I questioned the truth of it. And they read this lengthy statement. It was very interesting about how, race may be a social construct, but they felt the need to really explain their position, and it really didn't explain very much. It didn't get to the heart of what I think the essential contradiction is. But I was clearly singled out for the students. Everyone knew who I was, and I could walk around the school hearing them read about the incident. And they recommitted to their mission of quote unquote undoing racism, which is, again, this thing which is very interesting. The idea that you can undo history is, that's a deeply utopian thing that you can try to do. Yeah, you can try to make things a little better. You can create a fairer society. The idea that you can undo the crimes of the past, you can't do that without a time machine. So I found it very strange.
So you write this epic essay, which everyone needs to read if they haven't already read it already, in Common Sense by Barry Weiss, and it was really early in her run, if memory serves. This is like a real opening night piece, sort of. And
no, I'm glad. I was really grateful to the opportunity, and she's gone on to the thing is having tremendous success, and it's great. And I. There was my piece, and there was another piece by Andrew Gutman, the Brearley parent. I think his was reprinted a couple days later, and And I think it did. I think it did have an impact. I'm proud of it. I'm glad I spent a lot of time crafting it and really thinking about what I wanted to say and getting it right. And I reread it for this interview, and I was looking back on it. I stand by everything. Like it all happened.
Well, the administrators don't agree with you, Paul, because they came back and refuted some of the claims. Now, correct me if I get the order of this wrong or anything like that. So some of the claims were refuted, and then you responded in kind, obviously with some consultation, and released some phone recordings to set the record straight. Is that right?
Yes. I can't recall exactly what their refutations or their attempted refutations were. I think they claimed that I had misrepresented some things in my piece, but I don't believe that they were specific about it. And if they were, and I'd be happy to address them. But then, so in response to that, I said, well, I'm surprised that you're actually trying to refute my article because you agreed with me in a private conversation that there was a problem with these things at the school. And I cited 3 things that the head of school had said in a private conversation with me, and then he denied those things in a letter that he posted in response. So there was this week or so where we were kind of lobbing PR missives back and forth. And then since I had recorded that meeting, because I was fearful for, losing my job, and I felt I needed to protect myself. And in New York State, we are a one-party consent state, so you don't need to have the consent of both parties to make a recording. I released the sections that pertain to what I had said that he said, and he indeed said those things. And you can hear those things. I have those recordings are published on Odyssey now, as well as at the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, which they were helping me at the time.
Let me ask you something, George, because I think there's something very different about having a single experience where you make sense of it, right? And having a teacher, an authority figure, talk to you endlessly every year telling you that because you have whiteness, you are associated with evils, all these different evils. These are moral evils. It's not the same as taking like a physical thing, because it doesn't affect your moral value. That's the problem.
The fact is that I'm agreeing with you that there has been a demonization that we need to get our hands around in the way in which people are doing this understanding.
Okay, so you agree that we're demonizing kids?
We're demonizing we're demonizing white people for being born.
And are some of our students white people?
What?
Are some of our students white people?
Yes.
Okay, so we're demonizing white kids. Why don't you just say it?
We are using language that makes them feel less than for nothing that they are personally responsible for. You can have, and I'm happy to keep debating, and I don't actually have any doubt, because I've known you for 9 years, of your sincerity in your belief. And I also have grave doubts about some of the doctrinaire stuff that gets spouted at us in the name of anti-racism.
Like what?
And so I don't disagree entirely with some of your points of view.
Can you elaborate? Because it would help me. It would help me understand what's going on.
I think that one of the things that's going on a little too much, and we've talked about this, is that the demonization of being white and the attempt to link anybody who's white to the perpetuation of white supremacy.
Thank you. Thank you, George.
So there is no question that there is an entire strain in here that causes that misinterpretation. Now, I am someone...
Wait a minute. But what about impact over intent? Don't those kids get the benefit of impact over intent?
When I heard these recordings, I was following it in real time, it was quite spectacular. What does it feel like to be like Han Solo and know that you've got the blaster under the table? Just like, you know, when this guy has said something that's completely false. And did you just go, "I've got you, brother"?
Yeah, I mean, there was like a tremendous, to be honest, like, yeah, it was like a tremendous, you know, finally, I'm, you know, it's impossible after going through years of this where you're told one thing in private, right? Because they're masters of dissimulation and sort of humoring you. You know, I had been led for years to believe that the objections that I shared with them in private, that they were thinking about them, they were going to make changes in the school, they were going to do things about it in the school culture, and then they would do nothing, and then they would simply double down. So, you know, the fact that he admitted that there was demonization going on, it wasn't my word. I didn't put it in he came up with it himself. And that, you know, some of the things that we're asked to do in the name of anti-racism are, you know, I forget the exact words, but have gone too far. You know, the idea that you're ahead of school and you don't do anything about it, if you know that, right? That was the thing that said, okay, I got to do this because, you know, I can understand his position. I certainly have empathy for his position. A school like Grace Church has multiple constituencies, right? And so the person who's in charge of that is kind of in a position where you kind of have to speak out of both sides of your mouth based on the nature of the position, a little bit, right? You can't overdo it like he did, but you do have to frame things in such a way that you keep a lot of people happy who are paying, you know, $60,000 a year, whatever the hell it was. And, you know, I felt like someone in George Davison's position, he was the head of the whole school, and he was the person I spoke to and released the recordings of, is sort of like someone who's being drawn and quartered. It's not between a rock and a hard place. It's you're actually getting pulled in multiple directions by different constituencies so that you essentially are being put on the rack. And I have a lot of empathy for it. But at the same time, I realized that I had to do this because it had gone too far. And I personally knew that there were kids that were being totally intimidated by their teachers in the situation. I had a kid come to me, thanking me for speaking out in that February meeting, but looking over his shoulder at because there were cameras. He was worried that his teacher was going to see him on the cameras, coming to talk to me, and and he had reason to believe that too, because he proceeded to tell me multiple stories about how that teacher had held him after class because he defended capitalism. Things that are just ridiculous to say. And another teacher that said when he questioned, or a friend of his had questioned the statistics around the deaths of trans people, whether that was disproportionate or were the murders because they were trans, or that teacher said, I'm going to be watching you to make sure you do better. You committed harm to our trans students today.
Do better
with that question.
There it
do
is.
better, I'll be watching you. Right. So I knew that something had to be done, and I did it. And yes, it was a Han Solo moment, but it was followed quickly by a kind of pity for him, because he had to. I heard through sources that he had to really do a fall on his knees apology to the school, and to say that I had somehow tricked him, and he released something saying that I had tricked him. I didn't trick him.
But what I find interesting is, if these people wholeheartedly believe what they say, then why do they not sing it loud and proud? George seemed quite timid when you were pushing him in the phone conversation. Mm-hmm. If they are on the right side of history, then he's got nothing to worry about, right?
Well, it's interesting. I had, to his credit, every year he would have 30-minute meetings with every member of the faculty and staff. So that's a lot of scheduling. That's like 70 meetings. 70 half-hour meetings. And at every previous meeting, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, he had done that. He had been wholeheartedly, completely, pro-anti-racism. We're doing the right thing. This needs to be addressed. We need to, and I'm going to tell you that I think that there are some bad signs going on here. There are moral hazards. If you're going to define your school against something, but you don't really know what racism is, you need to be very clear about what it is, so that there's an objective standard, objectivity again. But he seemed to say, no, we'll figure it out. We'll get through it. We'll, trust me. And this was the first meeting I had had with him where he suggested, at a meeting where he was essentially reprimanding me. I mean, I had embarrassed the school. I had, because our yearly meeting took place a week after this February Zoom meeting. I had embarrassed the school. I was supposed to be doing something else at the time. I shouldn't have been even on the meeting because I was on a field trip with kids, but it was being covered. So, there were, but there was the first time that he mentioned any problems with what was going on, and I was shocked and I was pleased at the same time, but also kind of scandalized because like, well, you really do think that you really do see something's wrong, so you got to fix it. And he had some ideas. He said, well, at the end of the year, we're all going to come together and we're going to, reset. And I'm going to read Abraham Lincoln's famous speech from, with malice towards none. And I'm like, that's not going to do anything. You have ideologues teaching in your school. You have set up an entire system where I said my metaphor was the barn doors open and everyone's in the barn. These people they don't care about your beautiful over 100-year institution. They want to transform society, and they're using young minds to do it.
And you're being very charitable to him and very generous, which is great. But he's enabled this, and he's getting paid like $5,000 a day, like just to be there and to his job is to communicate with people. But this guy's an enabler, and I'm so outraged because those recordings were just such a smoking gun moment where I was like, this is. Yeah, as Ricky said, what's wrong, guys? Like, if you love what you say, if you believe it, I think it should be, I reckon they should say it loud, put it everywhere, put it on T-shirts, just get it out there. But instead what I see is tap dancing and playing with language. And these people seem to live in the ellipses. They love ellipses. They go, well... ... and then you've got to fill in
right,
and
right.
you go, and then you end up saying, yeah, because of whiteness, right? And they go, They don't say that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It. Yeah. No, that's a persuasive technique. It's called the vacuum, right?
Yeah.
So you leave this pregnant pause, and you get the person to fill in the pause, and that way you haven't said anything. And this is actually like an indoctrination technique too. That you'd see this in the classroom.
Well, that's a Scientology technique. The whole thing where they hold the cans and they do the e-meter reading.
Oh, right, the e-meter, yeah.
Yeah, they leave kind of a pause. Oh, something, I measured something on the e-meter there, and then you kind of fill in the gap, and they go, yes, it must have been that,
It's cold. Yeah, it's cold reading. I mean, it's the same techniques like charlatans use it all the time. Car salesmen, It's with the oldest stuff in the book.
Well, Paul, obviously be mindful of your time, but look, you've obviously had time to reflect on the whole episode, no doubt, and you've probably received a lot of feedback, over the years and whatnot. And so, do you think you could give our listeners a sort of a down and dirty playbook of what to look for and what to do if they think their school is going down this path? And this could be from the perspective of educators, parents, or students, or whatever you think.
Yeah, I think the people that need to be most vigilant are the parents. I think one of the positive signs in the culture in America has been the parents' rights movement, even in the level of just transparency. Let's just talk about many of these schools, particularly the private schools. They actually, the NIS, the organization I was talking about earlier, they have a handbook for how to keep parents at arm's length, essentially. And I have that handbook. And they have pages in there about how, as the experts, we are the senior partner in the student's development, right? The parent is the secondary partner, right? So it's the idea that these institutions are carving out an intimacy with your child, right? When they go to school, they want to create a relationship. Okay, and this is where all the grooming stuff comes from. They're not physically grooming the kids, but it is a great word if you're talking about intellectual and moral grooming, right? Grooming them into a belief system, and so what as a parent, what do you look for? The thing that I would say is try to get access to every assignment. Okay, every assignment, every activity, whatever you can get your hands on, And if you need to say it as, I want to be able to, assist my child. They're struggling. Maybe they need a little help academically. I want to provide that for them. Could I have access to the learning management system, or whatever, the syllabus or something like that. The best thing, of course, is to just talk to your kid and get their cooperation, so that they're sharing what's going on, and to listen. Right? I think a lot of parents get into I don't have children myself. I'm not a parent, but I hear from the kids' side a lot of the things that drive them away from their parents is presumptions, assumptions about what they're doing, or jumping to conclusions, or being too aggressive, or things like that. Just ask your child a question, and then don't interrupt them, and let them, once you get them talking, which can be hard, I know, it's like, just elicit what they're feeling, what are they thinking about what's going on in the classroom, and if you can, ask a question which gets them to reevaluate, or maybe have a counterbalance to what the teacher's feeding them. Because I guarantee you, in 99% of the cases, these schools, the teachers are feeding them a particular type of, woke ideology around particularly history, literature, although now it's even in language and math and science. So, if you've had that relationship with your child up to that point, that really helps, because then they're more likely to communicate. But also reach out to the teachers, and a lot of these teachers, if you're polite and nice and respectful of the teacher, they'll share this material with you because they're proud of it, right? They're changing society. They want you to be on board. They want to create an entire universe of agreement around these ideas, so that when the child goes home, the parent is also aligned with this social justice ideology, and then that just helps them. So there are ways that you can engage with teachers to get that material, and that's the first thing. And then the other thing is to reach out and find teachers, other potential teachers or parents that are also uncomfortable with it, because then you can form an actual power block. The one thing that these schools, particularly the private schools, do not want is to confront parents as a group. That's why they will always push you to do one-on-one interviews where they can tell you things and pat you on the head and send you away. But they will never have a town hall where they're taking questions from large groups of parents.
We've seen those.
They are
spectacular.
You get that in public school because the school boards have to do that, right? That's in the rules. But in private schools, they don't have to do that, and they'll avoid that as much as possible.
They're some of my favourite social clips, seeing those.
Yeah, it's great.
We're coming to the end of our interview here. We thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about Chalkboard Heresy.
Yes, we're really excited about that. I've made friends with a public school teacher who's very vocal on Twitter. He taught at a school in a school district near Chicago, and he has. We've decided to create a channel where we are going to host teachers, mostly teachers, some parents, and some older students potentially, to hear from them about what they're experiencing in their jobs, in their careers, in their schools, and really workshop strategies for how to push back and bring more viewpoint diversity to the classroom, more balance to the discussion, how to bring confidence to students who are questioning this material, because ultimately the best advocates for a more balanced perspective are going to be the students, because they're going to have to live in this world with all these other kids. So, we want to give that platform as much as we can. We just had our first guest. We released that last week. A teacher named Theodore Olson, who taught in the St. Paul school district in Minnesota, who was canceled way back in 2017. And he was not only canceled in his district, but he was hounded from
We listened to the episode.
School to school. You did? Okay,
It's great. Everyone should check it out. This poor guy was fired like 10 times.
And he's a liberal. I mean, he is not a fire-breathing conservative. Far from it. He's, he at his current job, he talks about how much he loves the diversity and his crime. But I'll let our listeners listen to it. But it was pretty minor.
Yeah, it's a pretty harrowing story, actually, to see how that's affected him too, just the hounding from job to job. Yeah.
Well, just a tiny follow-up to that, because we are wrapping up. But do you think that there's been a shift since his day in 2017, 2016, and now? Do you think that landscape has changed? Do you think that some of these places might be a little bit more hesitant to be so fast and loose in terms of running people out?
It's hard for me to speak to the public school environment. I tend to think yes, because there is much. If you think about the PR war, I think that we made a lot of progress in the PR. I mean, there are more parents are more vocal. Not many teachers are vocal. Not as many as I'd hoped, but some. That's probably because unions are still very social justice oriented. But I would say. I think there's been progress. I'm not sure how much institutional progress has been made. Like all of this material is still in the schools, most of them, right? There have been bills passed, there have been laws passed. I tend not to be sanguine about the prospect of these laws. They're not. Some of them I think are overreached. Some of them are better crafted than others. But essentially, when the door closes, the teacher's in control. And if unless they're on libs of TikTok going absolutely batshit. They're not going to get caught, right? And there are subtle ways. I think one of the best illustrations of that was the recent Project Veritas video, where I think it was an administrator and the honeypot, whoever it was asking them, how do you indoctrinate the kids? And he says, well, we don't just tell them what to think, right? I mean, it's more subtle than that. For example, with the Dobbs decision, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, we'll say something like, well, the majority of people in the country feel that, that abortion is a basic human right. But this small group of mostly men decided to take that away. Do you think that's fair? Right. And what child is going to say, well, you're going against, well, no, I don't think that's fair. Right. And that's not the kid's fault. But the intellectually honest position would be to say, actually, sometimes we go against the will of the majority when it's just. For example, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, where most of the country was against interracial marriage, and the Supreme Court said no, that's wrong, and we're going to go against. So the casuistry, the motivated reasoning around these things is something that they're aiming at children, okay? That is completely irresponsible. As an educator, you have to, devote, some time to the principle, not just use it, willy-nilly when it suits you for your agenda. So I thought that was pretty revealing.
Well, I'll say what James Lindsay can't say on Twitter: groomers.
Yeah.
Well, we have a final question that we would like to ask all of our guests, and that is, what are you reading right now?
Oh, I'm reading Thought Reform, a book on the Communist Party in China, refugees from the Communist Party who were interviewed by a psychologist. I think it's Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Was that it, or is it a different one? I get confused. I'm really bad with titles of books because I dig into the book and then I can't remember the title. But another book that I read, which is terrific recently, is called Destructive Generation.
Destructive Generation.
I don't know if you've heard of this book. Peter Collier and David, I think his name is, I'm going to forget the second author's name, but there's a series of vignettes and narratives told about the 60s and 70s when, groups like the Weathermen, the Black Panthers were really ascendant in the counterculture, and what it was like, because the authors were sort of ex-lefties that became neocons, and what it was like to actually be involved in these groups at the time, looking back on it. And it's extremely well written. It's excellent narrative, and you can get it on Amazon.
To check it out, because the 60s is certainly, it's one of those hallowed times of the left. They sort of hold it up as being like...
Yeah, and he talks about how, the 60s was sanitized on purpose by people who wanted to reconstruct its memory in a particular way to brush under the rug the extremeness, the extreme ideology. And so that he gets into that too. That's kind of like as much of a fiction as the Confederate statues are in the South. We have our own fiction about, the 60s were this magical time, not really.
Definitely have to read that one. Well, Paul, look, to be honest with you, there's I think we've got 3 pages of questions we didn't ask, so we're going to have to ask you to come back.
I'd love to come back, sure.
Next year, and we'll check in with you, and hopefully you're many episodes deep on your new podcast, and we can catch up on a whole range of things.
That'd be terrific, guys.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.